You have this fan fiction series of the modern day Little Woman. I enjoy a few other people, and you write about Joy and Frederick being demisexuals. Would you like to share the listeners what a demisexual is? I identify myself somewhere in the demisexual area, and I always need to explain it to people.
The best way I found someone describe it, asexual is when you have no sexual desire at all. And if you're allosexual, it means you can have it just at a drop of a hat, pretty much. But the best way I saw someone describe it is, for someone who is demisexual, is I'm asexual until I'm not. And the moment when you're not is when you develop a romantic attraction towards someone. And I understand some people who have that sort of wish fulfillment of wanting certain characters to be LGBT. Like I've seen a lot of people will say that Joe is trans, but, and whatnot. But it's surprising when people say, I think Joe is aro-ace, meaning aromantic and asexual. And I'm like, I feel like Joe is more of the demi-romantic, which is you don't develop a romantic attraction until you really get to know them, or having a romantic interest in someone until you, for some people, it'd be like, you just met this person, talked to them for 5 minutes, want to go on a date, and they're like, all right, fine. A demi-romantic needs time of development in order for them to be kind of like, you know what, I think I might want to date you. But I see her as a demi-romantic and a demisexual, and Friedrich as a demisexual, because these two, and it's mentioned under the umbrella scene where he says first love is the best, and she agrees, meaning that the both of them have been each other's first love, So I definitely catch some of those sort of vibes in that sense of the fact that they haven't really seemed to have found much of an interest in other people in accepting each other. And I feel like, as personally a demisexual, for the longest time, I was I didn't know why I was didn't have that same interest as the other kids when they were developing and all that. And I'm like, oh, now it makes sense, why I don't. I almost feel like Joe has that, she can't find herself having that with Laurie. One of these days, I think I will revamp that series, but I sort of have this moment where, in the modern day sense, she tells Laurie, if it hasn't happened by now, it's never going to happen. And if all these years I have been with you and have not felt even remotely romantic attraction for you, it's just not going to happen. The fact that, she doesn't even think about that with Laurie and blushes at the idea of it with Friedrich, I think is very telling. So I think it's a shame that people sort of miss on that. And in some ways I feel incorrectly, well, she's a lesbian because she doesn't want to get married. And it's that's not the reason why she doesn't want to get married to anyone. It's not because she's a lesbian, it's because other things that she, has to relearn over time. And she definitely, as we sort of joke, she definitely wants Friedrich's babies. Like you said, she wants a family of her own. And at one point, it was after Joe gets Plumfield, she's already fantasizing of not only a school for kids to come in, but she's already fantasizing a family with Friedrich and how that. So this girl wants his babies and gets all flustered and is do I look all right? Oh my goodness, we kissed and all that kind of stuff. I feel that most people just don't. It's because I think they see movie versions of it and they sort of see it in this way. I guess if it's not Laurie, then let her be a lesbian or let her be aro-ace. But it's we can still have an LGBT character in Joe, but still let it be with Friedrich. There's not a wrong answer here. We can have both. And I feel there's contextually evidence of that, as I kind of had mentioned earlier, just comparing how Joe is with Friedrich versus Joe with Laurie. If I ever could get a chance to make my own version, I would make that be pretty clear. In my vision, my modern day verse would be very clear. No, Joe and Friedrich are demis and they are totally for each other. So yeah, that's sort of my personal headcanon, which I've seen quite a few people sort of hop on board with that idea, which I'm quite pleased with, because I think not only is it true to the character, I think people don't recognize or fully like remember like demisexual is a thing. I think it's just like people kind of think you either want to or not, and it's like, well, here's the middle ground, the gray area, gray sexual, and that doesn't make them any less valid or invalid. Like that, it's still a very valid thing to be a demi, whether it's demi-romantic or demisexual. So it makes me happy to see that there's sort of this rise in people seeing like, yeah, you know, that makes a lot more sense. And I'm like, good, we're on the same page.
Well, I've done research on the Victorian idea of love, what love meant for people in the 19th century. I actually think demisexuality in modern standards would be closest to that, because there is this pop culture idea of love where you have sort of separated from love. The Victorian people, they saw love as almost like a spiritual experience. You could not separate love from. So there were people who did that back then, but a romantic love, which leads on to marriage, you would not separate the two. So I think demisexuality, sometimes it's seen almost as a movement against this sort of polarization of media, or the way we are surrounded by images, the stories where and love is removed from one another. When you fall in love with somebody, you get into a higher spiritual sphere. So I think demisexuality is connected to that type of idea, that you are not against. You just want to be with somebody who you feel emotional connection with. That's the way I always read Joseph and Frederick's relationship.
Like, it's not necessary for them to have this fully blown romantic relationship, but it just would be nice. If they chose not to, that's like, that's great. Like you said, it's more of what it is that connects them that way than it is what this is just kind of a nice bonus to a romantic relationship.
Louisa May Alcott, she did have older and younger male friends who she was attracted to. But then she also had quite a clear idea what kind of relationship she wanted for herself. It included that intellectual connection. 2018 film, the modern version, actually did that pretty well. And I think the actors had pretty good chemistry. At least in that one, I got the sense that Joe and Frederick were both demisexuals. And I think the actors had pretty good chemistry.
We see them developing a relationship. Like, I always just kind of remember the scene in the theater when he takes her hand and she just kind of looks at him like, oh, what is this feeling? Like, oh, she's like, what is this? I feel something. Yeah, I definitely get that feeling that it's probably the one version I feel like is the closest to that kind of sense. Like you said, that they're both demis and that they're more interested in how their relationship develops than, you know, in any other way emotionally.
And I think the actors had pretty good chemistry.
We see them developing a relationship. Like, I always just kind of remember the scene in the theater when he takes her hand and she just kind of looks at him like, oh, what is this feeling? Like, oh, she's like, what is this? I feel something. Yeah, I definitely get that feeling that it's probably the one version I feel like is the closest to that kind of sense. Like you said, that they're both demis and that they're more interested in how their relationship develops than, you know, in any other way emotionally.
I really like that version when it comes to Joe and Frederick.
Yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised by that version. Like, because sometimes modern day versions, it can be difficult in regards to how do they translate certain things that happened back then. Like, how do you still get that same sense of a debutante ball? Like, what would be the modern day equivalent? It's like, oh, well, be smart about it. It doesn't exactly have to be the same essence. You just need a big party. What's a big party? Prom. But they managed to do very well quite a lot of the things. That, like, I saw someone get upset that it wasn't the ice skating, but that it was a horse that could see me to almost like get herself get seriously harmed. And I'm like, well, first of all, I don't think that really was that bad of a change, like, honestly. And it makes sense because nowadays there isn't a lot of those sort of open lakes for people to go ice skating. There's more ice skating rinks available for the public. Whereas with like if you're riding a horse, there is the danger of if you go a little too fast, the horse suddenly stops when you're supposed to jump over a thing and you fall off. Like, I think that's a very fair way of translating it. But I went into it with low expectations because I didn't want to get my hopes up. And I walked out being like, this is top 3, I'll say, of favorite adaptations, honestly.
Well, people can really tell how much demisexuals we are, because it's so absurd to us when people are complaining about the actors' looks.
Yeah.
When I posted some of the clips of the 2018 film to my YouTube channel, and people were just saying how gorgeous Ian Bohen is. Like, I'm not saying he's not gorgeous, but can we talk about something else, like their relationship? Hopefully, maybe this helps people to understand what a demisexual is. Yeah, Ian Bohen, he's very handsome, but there's so much more in that movie. Same with Rosanna Brass in the 1949 film. Like, people just say, oh, he's gorgeous. Can we talk about his and Joe's relationship in this movie? That's why I posted these clips today.
Right. Can we talk about the fact that he pretty much is like, I think you are an amazing writer and I support you. You go, girl. Like, honestly, I say Friedrich is a feminist icon, honestly. He would definitely be that guy that is just like, that's my wife, like, you know, and be 100% proud. It took Laurie to sort of, I think, time to get to that point, but like Friedrich right off the bat is like, women are awesome and I love them. But yeah, that's, yeah, I totally agree. Like, you know, everyone was like, oh, you know, Louis Guerra's, you know, probably the handsomest Friedrich. And I'm like, okay, fine, but is he going to be a good Friedrich? And I think he was probably the highlight of that film. I think he himself is a good actor, but like, talk about whether or not, like, is the relationship between Joe and Friedrich actually good or not? Why does it matter? Or like when people say like, oh, why that guy? He looks way too old, or he's not as attractive. It's like, hey, did you see that moment when like he just said, I have nothing to give but a full heart and empty hands? Like, how? Like, oh my God. Guys, when you see people talk about like, oh, I love those like angsty romance heroes who love someone, but they want them to be happy, like almost like a Colonel Brandon type. I'm like, here's Friedrich right there. Like he doesn't think that he is deserving of Joe, but he supports her. And when he gets to Concord and he feels like there's maybe hope, he's got a picture of Joe and he kisses it because he's like, I'm so happy to see you again. And I think there might be a chance, like, oh, you know, there's so much. But no, people want to talk about, is he attractive or not? And it's like, point here, you go way over.
Somebody posted on Twitter that scene where in the 2017 series he comes and he has that poem with him. I'm like, this is my favorite scene in this whole series, or the whole asexual conversation. I think coming from the fact that I guess people should know that in the Victorian times it was entirely censored, because when I was reading these studies of Henry David Thoreau to my podcast, he actually censored words like bedroom and bathroom and all the names of his love interest from his diaries. Sometimes you can see how he changed word devotion and worship to great admiration. And Louisa May Alcott did the same. Some of the things might be lost when we don't pay attention to the historical context. And I think you can see that in Little Woman, because in the chapter All Alone, there's this scene where the narrator says that don't pity the spinster, because a lot of them hide tragic romances behind humble gowns, talking about her lovers. Or this wish fulfillment that we have been discussing here. I read quite a few people saying that, oh, I'm like Joe. I don't want to get married. I just want to stay at home, be with my family. And I'm like, well, that's not the book, Joe, because she does not want to only stay at home. But she feels that she needs to take Beth's place, and she needs to take care of her parents and be this like spirit of the home. And then she does that for a couple of days. And she gets bored and she feels like this is not the life for me. What I really want is to live my own life, have a family, and find somebody. And that's when she gets this letter from Amy where she writes how happy she is with Laurie. And then she feels really lonely and envies their happiness. It makes me upset that people misread the book. Well, in this case, they probably don't read the book. If we want to understand Little Woman better, we should not ignore these things that happen in the novel.
And it's funny when you say, like, oh, I want to be just like Joe, where I don't get married and I stay home. I'm like, that sounds closer to who Beth is rather than Joe. Like, and yeah, it's amazing how people sort of misinterpret when people say things like, I see Joe as being trans and wanting to be a boy, and I'm like, fine, but like the reasoning you have behind it is that you think Joe acts like a boy because she truly wants to be a boy, and that's not exactly how it goes in the story. It's more of a wanting the freedom that a boy has. And again, as we mentioned earlier about the internalized misogyny that she has about being a girl. I don't want to be that person that says you're wrong, but on the other hand, like the reasoning you have behind it is not true to what the story actually portrays these characters to be.
I think it's really sad because, that whole chapter, All Alone, it's really miserable. I don't know anyone who can read that chapter and think that Joe just wants to be at home. I can't really think of anyone who can read, Amy's letter about Laurie and think that Joe envies Amy or Laurie. She envies that sister is happy and married, and then she herself is there at home trying to be something that she isn't. And then she has that discussion with Mommy, and she says that, well, Joe, it's okay if you want these other things. There's this preface that moment when Joe is looking at Meg with a baby. She says to her, do you think I could do a good job at being a mom? And Meg is like, well, it would be great. You would make a great mom.
So yeah, I agree. I think some versions, like the Gerwig version, make it seem like she's more jealous of Amy, of being with Laurie. And I'm like, not at all. Not at all. She's just more sad that there isn't a someone in her life, really. The same way that, whether it's Amy or Meg, she's in a way jealous of them both, not because of the men themselves, but because there is no one for her.
It was the same with Louisa May Alcott. She writes in her journal how she envied Anna and May. They were happily married. She wasn't. She was very lonely. You can definitely see that in Little Woman. And I always thought it was really interesting because when I read May Alcott's biography, it was mentioned that all the three sisters, May and Anna and Louisa, they had struggles finding partners for themselves because they wanted to find somebody who would love them, but also accept that they wanted to work or have a career. May wrote about herself being lonely because she really struggled finding someone who could support her artist career. Then she fell in love with Ernest. He supported her career and was a good husband, what I can tell. I think it tells a lot about 19th century. These women feel lonely because they can't find somebody who supports their career and gives them unconditional love. I think that's something that most people don't realize about Little Woman, is that she wants to have a career, then she also wants to combine that with family and love.
Yeah, and it wasn't the norm then. Like, they were sort of expected to, once you're married. That's, being married is your job. And this is, I would going off of how I think with Alcott that translates to Joe, which I sort of took into my own. They want to be married. They want to have someone. But again, between society telling them, you can't, you have to abide by these rules in order to find someone, or being told you have to change in order to get this. It can be very depressing. As I made a post, and you did see it, where I kind of went onto almost like a analysis of Joe and marriage. After a while, I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to say I don't care what I look like. And I put like this sort of explanation of, well, if anybody really would like me, they're going to like me with it, whether or not I dress this way. But it's like, I felt like the fashion industry didn't care how to dress me. They didn't care whether or not this would have fit me. And I think in a way Jo had that sort of feeling, that sense of, well, I guess if everyone's telling me that I'm too tall, I'm too loud, I am too this and that to be married, just as I had deep down cared that I wanted to look good, but being told pretty much your whole life that you're not suited for that kind of thing. And if you don't fit the mold of what is this idea of marriage, well, then I guess you won't get married. And I think Alcott felt the same way. And in her case, she never did get married. And tying into that sort of wish fulfillment writing, that she gives that to Jo, that she has this whole time feeling like, I guess I'm not suited for marriage because who's going to want to marry me? And then meets Friedrich, who is like, I love you for all that you are, and my idea of marriage is this. She gives that to Jo, that she has this whole time feeling like, I guess I'm not suited for marriage because who's going to want to marry me? And then meets Friedrich, who is like, I love you for all that you are, and my idea of marriage is this. I was, I guess, tailored to be your husband just because I feel the same way too. And I don't think people realize that when we talk about Jo and marriage, that Jo doesn't repel the idea of marriage because she doesn't want to be in love, or she doesn't want children, or even like the sense of independence. She thinks that marriage will tie you down because that's what the time period, as I kind of said earlier, being married is a job. It's a full-time job. That's all that she's going to do, and that's not what she wants. It takes her some time to sort of realize, and through her relationship with Friedrich, that you can be independent and married. You know, you can have both. It's not choose one or the other. And I think people sort of misinterpret that because they just think, almost the same way as Jo starts in the beginning, that she thinks you can't have one without the other. And I think that's a shame, because it's a very, and again, almost in a way a misogynistic sort of point of view, because it ties in with that, you know, oh, you want to be that feminine woman who gets married and is a stay-at-home mom and whatnot. Like I feel like if Meg wanted, like in the modern day, she would probably be more like a stay-at-home mom or something of that kind, and probably would get judged for it. It doesn't mean that you're not independent. You made the choice to want to be, you know, a stay-at-home mom or to be a wife. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden you lose any sense of self. It just means you've started this whole new other journey that can lead to something more of who you are as a person, and to get to spend it with someone that you love and trust enough to want to spend that journey, hopefully to the end of your lives.
And in the book, it's really Amy and Meg are the conventionally good-looking ones, so they are expected to get married. Beth and Jo are not expected to get. Beth was socially awkward. Jo had issues with her anger. Some men of the time probably considered her too independent, with her wanting to become a writer. When Jo reads the novel in the first part, The White World, it's so funny because when I read White World, well, this story is just like Jo reading in Little Woman, the leading character in White World. But she kind of has that similar situation. She doesn't really consider herself very pretty or attractive, and she feels that, you know, nobody's going to love me because of the way I am. And then she finds this pretty clear archetype character, and then they fall in love. So it's really interesting how that's integrated into the story of Little Woman. But obviously it was somehow a significant story to Louisa May Alcott, because if you believe that you are not worth of romance or love, and then you have these stories that you read which prove otherwise, must have found some inspiration there. There's one story that has this sort of Laurie archetype, who starts with this Jo type of character and then moves on to this character who is more similar to Amy. This transition happens. He also grows as a man. So I can see very clear connections to this literature that Louisa liked to read, and also these real life events that happened in her life and her relationships.
I was going to say, and I think it's interesting when you look at the bigger picture of, in general, how Alcott deals with marriage, because not all of them have the same kind of marriage. Like if you're going to look at how Meg and John's relationship develops, Laurie and Amy's relationship develops, and Joe and Friedrich's, they're not all the same. I think it takes a good writer to sort of make it be different enough, because it's just very easy to just be like, well, this is what I would want a marriage to be, and I'll make them all be the same. But like, you have different types of people and how they respond and react to things. And Meg and John kind of getting to that fight after the jam incident, that sort of thing I would never imagine happening between Joe and Friedrich, because their personalities are completely different between Meg and John's, particularly in the beginning of the marriage. And I think that it shows that not only what it is that I think Alcott in general was expecting and hoping a marriage would be, but understood that the realities of marriage for some people may not always be easy. For someone like Meg, who has always kind of had these dreams of having a little bit of money, would have these feelings of like, why can't we do this? And John, who's trying to help her, versus like Amy and Laurie, where money is not an issue and it is whatever they could want, they can get. And Joe and Friedrich, who are like, you know what, we both already know. We have no delusions of grandeur. We know that we're very hard-working people and we will work to be successful. But ultimately, they are all healthy relationships. They're just different. And I think that for someone who never got married herself, I think Alcott really understood that not every marriage is the same, but that doesn't mean that they're not good in their own way. It works for them. And I think it really shows that if you had paired, again, someone like Laurie with Joe, they would have clashed and not have moved forward in the same way. When you try to look at it in the bigger picture of these characters and their relationships with each other and with the people that they're with, it tells a lot, and I think it tells a lot of Alcott, who clearly was thinking a lot about marriage and its ups and its downs.